The traveling limner had painted saints and sinners, merchants and maidens, but he had never been shouted at by 7 people at once while standing on a scaffold in a grain village communal grange until the afternoon. He arrived in Millbrook to paint the harvest mural. "My grandfather founded this village," said Councilman Horace Pettigrew, jabbing a finger upward from the floor. "His face belongs in the center." "The Reeves lineage goes back 200 years, countered Councilwoman Margaret Stillwell. "Tradition demands tradition," interrupted Baker Simmons. "I feed this village. Every harvest feast comes from my ovens." The limner, whose name was Jonathan Jarreth, and who had spent 28 years learning that the best response to clients was often silence, said nothing. Instead, he looked past the arguing council members, through the open grange doors, to the threshing yard where the real work of harvest was happening. There, moving with a rhythm that made the other workers look clumsy by comparison, was an orc woman binding sheaves of wheat. Her green hands moved so fast the stalks seemed to jump into formation. She wore a simple work dress, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. Every motion was economical, powerful, graceful in the way that true skill becomes grace. Jonathan had been painting for 15 years, since he was 13 and his mother's eyes had begun to fail. He had learned to see then, really see, because he had to describe the world to her. The particular green of spring leaves, the way afternoon light turned dust into gold, the exact curve of a smile that meant joy rather than mere politeness. And he had learned something else. He could not paint lies. When a tavern keeper wanted to look noble, when a merchant's wife wanted to look young, when a knight wanted to look brave, Jonathan's brush would not cooperate. It found the truth instead. Sometimes that lost him commissions. Sometimes it earned him better ones. "Master Jarreth," said the Reeve, a thin man with a thinner mustache, "you have heard our positions. What say you?" Jonathan finally looked down at them. "I say I need to see the whole village at work before I decide the composition. I say I will paint truth, not flattery. And I say that if you continue arguing beneath my scaffold, I will accidentally spill paint on someone." The council members looked variously offended and amused. The Reeve cleared his throat. "Very well. You have 3 weeks before the harvest home feast. The wall is yours." They filed out, still muttering. Jonathan climbed down from the scaffold and walked to the doorway. The orc woman had finished another section of sheaves, each bundle perfect, each knot secure. She moved to the next pile of loose wheat without pausing, without looking up. "Excuse me," Jonathan said. She glanced over, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. Strong features, yes, with the small tusks characteristic of orc women just visible when her mouth was relaxed. Amber eyes that held wariness, but also a face of complete structural harmony, the kind of face that portrait painters prayed for. High cheekbones, a firm jaw, proportions that would translate beautifully to a wall 12 feet high. "Yes," she said. Her voice was lower than human women's voices, but not harsh, careful. "What is your name?" "Elara Greenhill." She had not stopped working while speaking. Another sheaf bound. Another knot tied. "I am Jonathan Jarreth. I am painting the harvest mural. I know, everyone knows." She moved to the next pile. "I would like you to sit for me." Her hand stopped, just for a moment, but it was the first time he had seen her pause. Sit, as a model, for the central figure. The sheaf maiden. Elara straightened fully, and he saw she was tall for a woman, perhaps 5.5 feet, built like an athlete with a laborer's strength in her shoulders and arms. She looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "That is a poor jest," she said flatly. "It is not a jest. The council wants council members, or their ancestors, or perhaps the baker. The council wants flattery. I paint truth. And the truth is you are the finest sheaf binder I have ever seen. Your proportions are perfect for the composition, and you are beautiful." She went red. Not pink, not flushed, but red as a sunset from her collarbone to her hairline. She took one step backward, turned, and walked directly into the doorframe of the storage shed with a sound like a drumbeat. "Saints and angels," Jonathan said, starting forward, but she had already recovered and disappeared into the shed. He stood in the threshing yard, alone with 36 perfect sheaves, and the growing certainty that he had just made either the best or worst decision of his commission. That evening, Jonathan took a room at the village single inn, a sturdy building called the Wheat Sheaf that served decent ale and better bread. The innkeeper, a woman named Dorothy who had immediately tried to convince him to paint her daughter on the mural, showed him to a small, clean room overlooking the main street. He spent an hour sketching the Grange wall's dimensions and proportions, calculating sight lines and light angles. Then he went downstairs for supper. The common room was full of harvest workers, and he learned quickly that Millbrook's economy revolved entirely around grain. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye filled the fields for miles in every direction. The village existed to store, process, and ship grain to the larger towns downriver. He also learned, by listening rather than asking, that Elara Greenhill had lived in Millbrook for 6 years, that she worked every harvest for wages, never on contract, that she could bind sheaves faster and tighter than anyone else, which meant she earned more than most of the men, that she lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the village, that she was, as far as anyone knew, 24 years old. What he did not hear was anyone calling her a friend. They spoke of her with respect, with acknowledgement of her skill, but not with warmth. He ate his stew and went to bed planning compositions. The next morning he rose early and went to the Grange with his sketching book. The threshing yard was already active. He found a spot on a bench against the wall and began to draw. He drew the workers in motion. The way the grain haulers bent to their loads, the way the threshers swung their flails, the way the winnowers tossed grain into the wind, and he drew Elara, over and over. The line of her back as she bent, the curve of her arms as she gathered stalks, the angle of her jaw, the concentration in her face, she noticed, of course. He saw her glance over several times, but she did not speak to him and he did not approach her. Not yet. He was learning her first. The way he had learned everything worth painting. On the third morning she walked over to his bench. He had just finished a sketch of her hands knotting twine. "You are still watching me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "I told you. I want you to model for the mural." "And I told you that was a poor jest." Jonathan looked up at her. She was backlit by morning sun, and the light caught in the fine wisps of hair that had escaped her braid. He wanted to paint her exactly like this, but the mural needed her binding sheaves, not standing in judgment. "Do you know what a limner does, Elara?" She frowned slightly. "You paint pictures. I paint truth. When my mother was going blind, she asked me to be her eyes. I was 13. I learned to describe everything exactly as it was, because anything less would be stealing the world from her. And when I picked up a brush, I found I could only paint what I truly saw. No flattery, no lies, just truth." "Then you are bad at your trade," Elara said. "People pay for flattery, some do, but some pay more for truth, and I see truth in you." She was quiet for a long moment. The sounds of the threshing yard went on around them. Finally she said, "What truth do you think you see? Strength, skill, grace, perfect structure, beauty." She went red again, though not as dramatically as before. "You are either mad or mocking me, neither. No one has ever." She stopped. Looked away. "I need to work. Will you sit for me?" "No." She walked away back to the sheaves, and Jonathan added her to his sketchbook again, this time with notes about the color of the morning light on green skin. The Reeve appeared at noon along with Councilman Pettigrew and Councilwoman Stillwell. "Master Jarreth," the Reeve said, "have you made progress on the design?" Jonathan showed them his sketches, compositions of harvest work, figures in motion, the grange, the fields, the village. "And the faces?" Pettigrew demanded. "Who will be featured? I have not decided. You must decide soon. We need time to approve. You hired me to paint," Jonathan interrupted mildly, "not to submit to committee approval. If you want a mural by committee, you should paint it yourselves." The Reeve's mustache quivered. "We expect to be consulted." "You have been consulted. I consulted you when you all shouted at me. Now I am working." Stillwell laughed despite herself. "He has a point, Reeve." They left, muttering again. Jonathan went back to sketching. That afternoon he bought bread and cheese from Baker Simmons and walked to the edge of the village. Elara's cottage was easy to find. The innkeeper's daughter had pointed it out when he asked where the workers lived. It was small, well-maintained, with a kitchen garden showing the end of summer vegetables. He knocked. Lara opened the door, still in her work dress, and stared at him. "What are you doing here?" "Bringing you lunch." "I have lunch." "Then bringing you company." "I did not invite company." "True," Jonathan said cheerfully. "But I thought you might answer questions better away from the threshing yard. May I come in?" She looked at him with deep suspicion, but after a moment she stepped aside. The cottage interior was plain but comfortable. A table, 2 chairs, a sleeping alcove, a hearth. Everything clean and orderly. No decorations except a single shelf of books, which surprised him. "You read," he said. "Is that so shocking?" "Not shocking. Just not common among harvest workers." "I am not common among harvest workers." She said it without arrogance, just fact. Jonathan set the bread and cheese on the table. "Will you share this with me and answer questions?" "What questions?" "About you. About your work. About why you think I am jesting when I say you are beautiful." She went red again, and he felt a small triumph at having caused it. "That is 3 questions," she said. "I have many more." She sighed and sat at the table, cut the bread with a knife that looked well cared for. "Ask, then. I make no promises to answer." Jonathan sat across from her. "Where did you learn to bind sheaves?" "My mother. She worked harvests in the eastern valleys. I worked beside her from the time I could hold stalks." "Is she still in the east?" "She died 4 years ago." Elara said it calmly, but Jonathan heard the loss beneath. "I am sorry. Death comes." "She taught me well before it came for her." "And you came here 6 years ago. Where were you before Millbrook?" "Other villages, other harvests. I go where the work is." "But you stayed here. The work is steady. The pay is fair. The Reeve does not cheat on the weights." She took a bite of bread. "Why does this matter for a painting?" "Because I do not paint empty faces. I paint people, and people are the sum of where they have been and what they have done." Elara looked at him for a long moment. "You talk strangely, so I have been told." "Why do you paint?" "Because my mother needed eyes, and I learned to see for her. Because the world is full of truth that people ignore. Because when I paint something true, I feel the way you look when you are binding sheaves." "How do I look?" "Like you are doing exactly what you were meant to do." She went quiet. Ate more bread. Finally she said, "Your mother, is she well?" "She died 2 years ago. But she saw a lifetime of the world through my words before her eyes closed. I am sorry for your loss, and I for yours." They sat in the quiet of shared grief, and Jonathan felt something shift between them. Not trust yet, but the possibility of it. "If I sat for you," Elara said slowly, "what would that require?" "You would come to the grange when your work is done. Sit or stand as I direct. Hold still for periods of time. I would sketch you, then paint you." "And the council? What about them? They want their own faces, or their ancestors' faces. They will not want an orc on their precious mural." Jonathan leaned forward. "That is their concern, not yours." I paint what I choose to paint. They hired me. They can accept the result or pay me and whitewash the wall. They will choose to whitewash. Perhaps, but the wall will have been painted true first. Elara studied his face. He let her look, knowing she was trying to determine if he was honest or mad or simply naive. "You truly believe I am beautiful," she said finally, not a question. "Yes. No one has ever said that before." "Then no one has looked properly. Many people have looked. They see an orc, green skin, tusks, strength that frightens them. I see all of that, and I see beauty. Both are true." She went red again, and this time she smiled slightly, just a quirk at the corner of her mouth. "You are very strange, Jonathan Jarreth." "So I have been told," he said again, and she laughed, a low, warm sound that made him smile in return. "I will sit for you," she said, "but I think you are going to cause trouble for yourself." "I have caused trouble before. I am still here." She shook her head but did not argue. They finished the bread and cheese, and Jonathan left feeling that he had won something more valuable than a model's agreement. The sittings began the next evening. Elara came to the Grange after the day's work, still in her work dress, and Jonathan posed her with sheaves of wheat, her hands in the position of binding. "Look toward the window," he said. "As if you are checking the light." She did. He sketched quickly, capturing the line of her profile, the way the evening sun came through the high Grange windows and lit her face. "You always work in silence?" she asked after a while. "No, talk if you wish, just keep your head still." "What should I talk about?" "Anything." "Tell me about the eastern valleys." So she did. She told him about the terraced fields where her mother had worked, the way the villages there built their houses into hillsides, the particular quality of light at dawn in the mountains. Her voice was steady, descriptive, and Jonathan realized she was doing for him what he had once done for his mother, describing the world in careful detail. "You have a good eye," he said. "I learned to watch. To see when the grain is ready, when the weather will turn, when the stalks are too dry or too wet. You cannot bind well without seeing. Is that why you read, to see other places?" "Yes, books are windows," he smiled. "My mother said the same thing." They worked for 2 hours until the light failed, and then Elara went home and Jonathan stayed to prepare the wall, mixing plaster and primer by lamplight. Over the next week, a pattern developed. Elara worked the threshing yard by day. Jonathan sketched the village, the fields, the workers. In the evenings, she sat for him while he refined the composition. And they talked. She told him about the villages that had refused her work, the ones where orcs were not welcome no matter how skilled. About the harvest master who had tried to cheat her on wages and the reeve who had intervened. About learning to read from a traveling scholar who had stopped in her mother's village and taught anyone who wanted to learn. He told her about growing up in a city 200 miles south, where his father had been a scribe and his mother a weaver before her eyes failed. About learning to paint on scraps of board, mixing his own pigments from anything he could find. About the first commission that had gone badly because he had painted the merchant's wife as she truly was, tired and sad instead of young and joyful. "What did the merchant do?" Elara asked. "Refused to pay. Then commissioned me again 6 months later after his wife left him and said he should have listened to what the painting showed him." "Did you paint him the second time?" "Yes. I painted him alone in his counting house, surrounded by coins, with a window showing the road his wife had taken. He hung it in his office. That is either very wise or very foolish of him. Both, I think. Most wisdom is." She laughed, and Jonathan found himself painting her laugh into his memory, wanting to capture it later. The council visited again at the end of the first week. Jonathan had begun the underpainting, blocking in the basic composition on the plastered wall. The central figure was clearly visible, A woman with sheaves, her face still blank. "Is that the sheaf maiden?" the reeve asked. "Yes." "And who will she be?" "You will see when she is painted." Pettigrew scowled. "We have a right to know." "You have a right to the finished mural which you will receive. The process is mine." They argued, but Jonathan had been argued at by bishops and guild masters. Village councillors were easy by comparison. He simply kept painting until they left. That evening, Elara arrived for her sitting and saw the underpainting. She stopped in the doorway, staring. "That is me," she said. "Yes." "That is the central figure." "Yes, Jonathan." She turned to look at him. "They will never allow this. They hired me to paint truth." "They hired you to paint flattery that looked like truth. You know that." "Perhaps. But the contract says I have artistic authority. I checked." Elara walked closer to the wall, studying the blocked-in figure. Even without details, the proportions were clearly hers. The height, the breadth of shoulder, the way she held the sheaves. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Because you are the truth of this village's harvest. Because every sheaf in every barn was bound by hands like yours. Because when people see this mural 50 years from now, they should see what actually happened, not what the council wishes had happened. And because you think I am beautiful. That too." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "When they whitewash this, I hope you will not be too hurt." "If they whitewash truth, the hurt is theirs, not mine." She shook her head but took her position, and he began painting in earnest. The second week brought the details. Jonathan painted with focus that bordered on obsession, working from dawn until the light failed and then by lamplight after. The sheaf maiden emerged from the wall. Green skin rendered in layers of pigment that caught every tone from forest to spring leaf. Amber eyes that looked toward the window with calm competence. Hands that held the wheat with visible strength and grace. He painted her face exactly as it was. The strong jaw, the high cheekbones, the small tusks just visible at the corners of her mouth. No softening, no humanizing, no compromise. Truth. The other figures in the mural were composites drawn from his sketches of the village workers. The threshers, the haulers, the winnowers. He gave them dignity and detail. But the composition led the eye always back to the sheaf maiden in the center, to Elara binding wheat in eternal harvest. People began to stop and watch him work. At first just curious passers-by, then regular observers. They saw the central figure taking shape and whispered among themselves. The harvest workers recognized her immediately. They watched with expressions Jonathan could not quite read. Not disapproval, but not enthusiasm either. Wariness, perhaps, or concern. The council did not visit. Jonathan took that as a bad sign. Elara came every evening, sitting when he needed her to sit, holding poses for the detail work. They talked less during these sessions. He needed focus for the fine work. But sometimes in the rests, they would share observations about the day, about the village, about nothing in particular. One evening, after he had finished painting her left hand in minute detail, she said, "Do you ever get lonely? Traveling, you mean?" "Yes, always moving. No home." Jonathan cleaned a brush thoughtfully. "Sometimes, but I am lonely in the way of always being in new places, not lonely in the way of being unseen. People always see the painter even if they do not know the man. I think I understand that. Do you get lonely?" "Yes," she said simply. "I am seen as a worker, as an orc, as strong or useful or strange, but not seen as myself. I see you." She looked at him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. "I know," she said quietly. "That is why I keep coming back." He wanted to kiss her. The impulse was sudden and fierce, and he had no idea if she would welcome it. So he did what he always did with strong impulses. He put it into his work instead. He painted her eyes with every bit of care and longing he felt, and when he stepped back to look at the result, he knew anyone who saw this mural would know the painter loved his subject. The thought should have frightened him. It did not. On the 13th day, Jonathan finished the sheaf maiden's face. He added the final highlights to her eyes, the last details to her expression, and then stepped down from the scaffold to view it from the floor. It was the best work he had ever done. Not because of technical skill, though the technique was sound, but because truth and love had worked together in every brushstroke, and the result was a figure that seemed to breathe. The harvest workers who had been watching throughout the day came closer. They stood in a semicircle, looking up at the wall. "That is Elara," one of them said finally, "a winnower named Thomas." "Aye," said another, "it is her exactly." "She is beautiful," said a third voice, a woman who hauled grain sacks. "I never noticed before, but she is." Jonathan felt a fierce satisfaction. They saw. Truth had made them see. But then the doors opened and the council filed in, all 7 of them, and Jonathan knew the reckoning had come. They stood where the workers had stood. They looked up at the mural. The silence stretched. "That is the orc girl," Pettigrew said finally, flat, hard. "That is Elara Greenhill," Jonathan replied, "the finest sheaf binder in your village." "That is not what we commissioned. You commissioned a harvest mural. That is what I painted." The Reeve's mustache quivered. "We commissioned a celebration of our village, our people." Not what?" Jonathan kept his voice level with effort. "Not truth. Not the worker who binds your grain, not the person who makes your harvest possible." "She is an orc," Pettigrew spat. "She is a member of your village." "She is a hired worker, not a member." "Then you do not deserve her work." Stillwell stepped forward, and Jonathan saw sympathy in her face, which somehow made it worse. "Master Jarreth, we understand your artistic vision, but you must understand our position. This mural will hang in our grange for generations. It represents us. We cannot have truth, cannot have an orc as the central figure of our most important communal space." Jonathan looked at each of them in turn. "Then we are at an impasse." "No," the Reeve said. "We are at a breach of contract. You were to consult with us on the design. You did not. You were to paint a mural acceptable to the village. This is not acceptable." "Acceptable to you? The workers seem to find it acceptable." "The workers do not commission art," Jonathan laughed bitterly. "No. They merely make everything else possible." "You will be paid for your time thus far," the Reeve continued. "But the work is rejected. We will have the wall replastered and hire another limner." "You could whitewash it," Jonathan said, "faster than replastering." He meant it as a bitter jest, but Pettigrew's eyes lit up. "Yes, whitewash it tonight, before more people see." "You cannot be serious," Jonathan said, but they were. He saw it in their faces. They were going to erase her. "Do what you must," Jonathan said coldly, "but you will pay me in full." "The contract said artistic authority was mine. I exercised it. Your rejection does not void my fee." The Reeve nodded stiffly. "Full fee. And you will leave Millbrook tomorrow." Gladly, they left, Pettigrew already calling for workers to bring whitewash. Jonathan stood alone in the grange, looking up at Elara's face on the wall, and felt a fury so deep it left him shaking. He had known this might happen. He had told Elara it might happen, but knowing and experiencing were different things. The workers came with whitewash and brushes. They looked uncomfortable, but they did as they were told. Jonathan could not watch. He left the grange as the first strokes of white paint covered green skin and walked into the village night without direction. He ended up at Elara's cottage without intending to. She opened the door at his knock, took one look at his face and said, "They rejected it. They are whitewashing it right now." She closed her eyes briefly. "I told you they would, I know, but I thought," he stopped. "I thought truth would matter. Truth matters to people who can afford it." The council cannot afford to see an orc as beautiful. It would complicate their world too much. I am so sorry, Elara. For what? For painting me as you saw me. For making me feel for a few days like I was worth painting. She shook her head. I'm not sorry for that, even if it is gone now. You saw it, though. You know how I see you. Yes. Her voice was soft. I know. They stood in her doorway, and Jonathan wanted to say 100 things, that he loved her, that he wanted to stay, that he wanted to paint her again and again until the world ran out of walls. But he was being banished from the village in the morning, and she had a life here, work here, a cottage and a trade. I leave tomorrow, he said instead. I know. I will miss you. And I will miss you. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was brief, chaste, a press of lips that held longing and sorrow and farewell. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Go, she said, before I ask you to stay and ruin everything. He went. He spent the night at the inn, sleepless, staring at the ceiling. At dawn, he packed his few belongings, took his full fee from the reeve with no words exchanged, and walked out of Millbrook as the sun rose. The whitewashed wall gleamed in the morning light, blank and empty, as if he had never painted anything at all. Elara watched Jonathan leave from her cottage window. She did not go to the road. She did not wave. She simply watched until he disappeared around the bend, and then she sat at her table and stared at nothing for a long time. She had known this would happen. She had warned him. But a small, traitorous part of her heart had hoped that maybe, this once, things would be different. They were not. She went to the threshing yard because work was the only remedy she knew for heartbreak. The sheaves needed binding. The harvest did not care about whitewashed murals. But when she arrived, the workers were standing in a cluster, talking in low, angry voices. Thomas the winnower saw her and waved her over. Elara, did you see what they did? Yes. It was beautiful, the painting. You were beautiful. She said nothing. They had no right, said the grain hauler, whose name was Beth. You bind half the sheaves in this village, more than half. They have every right. It is their grange. It is our grange too, Thomas said. We work there, we store grain there, we celebrate harvests there. And they whitewashed you like you were nothing. I am nothing to them. You are not nothing to us. Elara looked at him in surprise. Thomas was not a friend. None of them were friends. They were workers who labored side by side and went home separately, but something had changed in their faces. Something had shifted. The painting made us see, Beth said quietly. We have worked with you for years, Elara. We knew you were strong, that you were fast, but we never looked, not really. And then that painter made us look, and we saw you, and you were beautiful, and we had been blind. Elara felt heat rising in her face. I am just a worker. So are we all. But you are a worker who deserves better than whitewash. She did not know what to say. So she went to the sheaves and began binding, and the others went to their tasks, and the day proceeded. But something had changed. That afternoon, the reeve came to the threshing yard to negotiate the grange contract. Every harvest, the village contracted with the workers to process a certain quantity of grain through the communal grange, with payment based on volume and speed. Thomas, who usually spoke for the workers, stepped forward. We will not process grain through the grange this year. The reeve blinked. I beg your pardon, you heard me. We will not work the grange. That is absurd. The contract is negotiated annually. We are declining to negotiate this year. You cannot do that. The grain must be processed. The merchants are waiting. Then process it yourself, or hire new workers, but we will not work in a building that whitewashes its best workers. The reeve's face went red. This is about the orc. This is about Elara Greenhill, who binds more sheaves than any 3 workers combined, and who you erased because you could not stand the truth of your own harvest. This is extortion. This is refusal. We are free workers. We choose where we labor. The reeve turned to the assembled workers. "All of you agree with this madness," they nodded. "Every single one." He looked at Elara. "This is your doing." "No," Thomas said before she could speak. "This is yours. You commissioned truth and then whitewashed it. We are simply responding in kind." The reeve sputtered, threatened, cajoled. The workers stood firm. Finally he left, and the threshing yard erupted in nervous laughter. "You did not have to do that," Elara said. "Yes, we did," Beth replied. "Should have done it years ago, truth be told. Should have made you feel welcome instead of just useful." Elara felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been closed for a very long time. "Thank you," she said quietly. The standoff lasted 3 days. The reeve tried to hire workers from neighboring villages, but word had spread about the whitewashing. No one wanted to cross Millbrook's workers, who were known to be fair and organized. The grain sat unprocessed. The merchants sent angry letters. The council met in emergency session. On the 4th day, Pettigrew appeared at the threshing yard. He looked like he had swallowed something sour. "The council has voted," he said. "The mural will be restored." The workers said nothing. "Master Jarreth will be recalled and paid additional fees for the restoration. The work will proceed as he originally designed it." "And," Thomas prompted. "And I have been voted off the council for overstepping my authority in ordering the whitewashing without full council approval. Also," Pettigrew's jaw clenched, "I will personally pay the restoration fees." Thomas smiled. "Then we accept. The Grange contract will proceed as usual." Pettigrew turned and left without another word. Elara stood holding a half-bound sheaf, unable to process what had just happened. "They are bringing him back," Beth said. "Your painter." "He is not my painter." "Is he not?" Elara said nothing, but her heart was beating very fast. Jonathan received the message 5 days after leaving Millbrook. He was in a village 30 miles south, negotiating a commission to paint a tavern sign, when the reeve's letter arrived. It was stiffly worded, formally apologetic, and offered triple his original fee to return and restore the mural. He read it twice, then asked the messenger, "What happened?" "Workers refused the Grange contract. Village council folded. Pettigrew is out." Jonathan laughed. He could not help it. "The workers did that. I refused to process grain until the painting was restored. Cost Pettigrew his seat and his coin." Jonathan thought of Elara's face when she had said no one had ever called her beautiful, thought of the workers watching the mural take shape, seeing her truly for the first time. "Tell the reeve I will return," he said, "but I have conditions." The conditions were simple. Full artistic authority with no interference, a second commission to paint the new granary doors currently under construction, and Elara Greenhill's name on a plaque identifying her as the model for the sheaf maiden. The reeve agreed to everything. Jonathan arrived back in Millbrook on a bright autumn morning, 2 weeks after he had left. The whitewashed wall gleamed in the grange, blank and waiting. He went to the threshing yard first. Found Elara binding sheaves in the same steady rhythm, as if the world had not turned itself over in his absence. "Hello," he said. She looked up, and her face went through several expressions in quick succession. Shock, joy, wariness, hope. "You came back," she said. "I was invited." "Apparently there was some trouble with the Grange contract. Apparently, the workers stood up for you." "For the mural," she corrected. "For you," he insisted. "For truth. For the idea that you deserve to be seen." She set down the sheaf she was holding, stood, faced him fully. "Why did you come back?" "Because I have a mural to restore, and because I have another one to paint." "That is not what I mean." "I know." Jonathan stepped closer. "I came back because I missed you, because I think about you constantly, because when I paint now I want to paint you. Because I have been in love with you since the moment you walked into a doorframe, and leaving you was the hardest thing I have ever done." She went red, that beautiful deep scarlet that started at her collar and rose to her hairline. "Jonathan, you do not have to say anything. I know I am leaving again when the work is done. I know you have a life here. I just wanted you to know the truth of why I came back." "You are an idiot," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. You think I have a life here. I have work here, a cottage, books, but no life. No one who sees me. No one who knows me." She took a breath. "Until you, Elara. I missed you every day you were gone. I thought about you constantly. I want—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to stay, not just for the murals, for me." Joy rose in Jonathan's chest like a dawn. "I am a traveling limner. I go where the commissions are. Then I will travel with you. I can bind sheaves anywhere. Harvests happen everywhere. You would leave Millbrook. I would go anywhere you go if you want me." "Want you?" He laughed. "Elara, I love you. I want you more than I have ever wanted anything." She closed the distance between them and kissed him, and this time it was not brief or chaste. This time it was thorough and claiming and full of all the longing they had both held back. When they finally broke apart, several of the workers were watching and grinning. "Get back to work," Elara called, but she was smiling. Jonathan took her hand. "I have to restore a mural. Will you sit for me again? Every evening, as long as you need. I will need you for the rest of my life. Then I suppose I will be sitting for a very long time." They walked to the Grange together, hand in hand, while the workers cheered behind them. The restoration took a week. Jonathan worked from his original sketches, repainting the sheaf maiden exactly as she had been. The workers came to watch again, and this time they brought others. Families. Children. People who had heard about the whitewashing and the standoff and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. They saw Elara on the wall, immortalized in pigment and plaster. And they saw her in the Grange each evening, sitting for the painter who loved her, and the two images merged into understanding. By the time the restoration was complete, the whole village knew that the sheaf maiden was Elara Greenhill, and Elara Greenhill was beautiful. The Harvest Home feast came on schedule. The mural was unveiled formally, with the plaque Jonathan had insisted on mounted beside it. The sheaf maiden, modeled by Elara Greenhill, painted by Jonathan Jarreth. The applause was genuine. Even the council members clapped, though some looked uncomfortable. Jonathan did not care. He stood with Elara, holding her hand, and accepted the village's acknowledgement. The new granary doors were his next commission. They were large, 12 feet tall and 8 feet wide, designed to be opened during the day to allow grain wagons through and closed at night for security. "What will you paint?" the reeve asked. "The cycle of the year," Jonathan said. "Planting, growing, harvest, storage. The full agricultural cycle. And the figures, workers, real ones from the village." The reeve nodded and did not ask for approval rights. He had learned. Jonathan designed the doors as a matched pair, each showing half the cycle. He worked through the late autumn into early winter, painting scenes of plowing and planting, tending and harvest. And on both doors, appearing in multiple scenes, he painted Elara. Sometimes binding sheaves, sometimes carrying grain, sometimes simply standing in a field looking toward the horizon. She was not always the central figure, but she was always present. A constant truth of the village's agricultural life. Elara worked the late harvest and then the early winter contracts, repairing tools and preparing for the next season. And every evening she came to wherever Jonathan was painting, and they talked about everything and nothing. They talked about where they would go when the granary doors were finished, about the villages to the west that needed limners, the harvests to the south that needed workers, about building a life that moved with the seasons and the commissions, always together. "Will you marry me?" Jonathan asked one evening in early winter. He was high on a scaffold, painting wheat stalks on the upper left door, Elara was sitting below, mending a binding hook. She looked up. "What?" "Will you marry me?" he repeated. "I know I should ask more formally with a ring and a speech, but I am on a scaffold and you are beautiful in the lamplight and I do not want to wait." She started laughing. "You are asking me to marry you from a scaffold?" "Yes. Is that a problem?" "Most men ask on one knee." "I will fall off the scaffold if I kneel. Is that a yes or a no?" She climbed the scaffold, moving with the ease of someone who had worked heights before, and kissed him. "Yes, you ridiculous man, yes." He nearly dropped his paintbrush. "Yes, yes. I will marry you, travel with you, sit for every painting you ever make, and love you for the rest of my life." "Yes." He set down the brush carefully and pulled her close, mindful of the paint and the height and the precariousness of the moment. "I love you, I know. You painted it on a wall for everyone to see. I will paint it again, on every wall in every village for the rest of my life. You will run out of villages. Then I will paint very large walls." She laughed and kissed him again, and below them someone cleared their throat. They looked down. The reeve stood at the base of the scaffold, looking up with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "I hate to interrupt," he said, "but the village scribe is here. If you are getting married, she will need to record the banns." "The banns," Elara repeated. "Yes, the banns. 3 weeks of public posting before a marriage can occur, unless you want to travel to the cathedral in the city and pay for special dispensation." Jonathan looked at Elara. "What do you want?" "I want to marry you properly, with the village as witness. Then we post the banns." The scribe, a cheerful older woman named Agnes, arrived with her record book and took down their names, ages, and intentions. The banns would be posted on the village message board and read aloud at the weekly market for 3 consecutive weeks. "You have created quite a stir, you two," Agnes said as she wrote. "First the mural, then the standoff, now a wedding. Millbrook will be talking about this for years." "Good," Elara said firmly. "Let them talk. Let them see." Jonathan squeezed her hand and Agnes smiled. The 3 weeks passed in a blur of painting and planning. Jonathan finished the granary doors, working extra hours to complete them before the wedding. The village women, led by Beth and Agnes, insisted on making Elara a wedding dress. "I do not need a fancy dress," Elara protested. "Every woman needs a wedding dress," Beth said. "Let us do this for you." Elara, who had never had women fuss over her, submitted to measuring and fabric selection and fitting with bewildered grace. Jonathan, meanwhile, was adopted by Thomas and the other workers, who informed him that a proper wedding required a proper celebration. "We will handle the feast," Thomas said. "You just paint your doors and show up on time." "I can help, you can paint. That is what you do, we will do the rest." So Jonathan painted, and the village prepared, and the banns were read weekly without objection. The granary doors were finished 3 days before the wedding. Jonathan unveiled them on a cold, clear morning, with half the village present. The doors showed the full year of agriculture, plowing fields in spring rain, tending crops under summer sun, harvesting wheat in autumn gold, storing grain in winter frost. And through all the scenes, Elara appeared, planting, binding, carrying, watching. At the bottom of the right-hand door, Jonathan had painted a small scene of a man and a woman standing together in a harvested field, looking toward the horizon. The woman was clearly Elara. The man was clearly him, and beneath the scene, in careful letters, "Truth and love bound together." The crowd was silent for a long moment. Then they began to applaud. The reeve stepped forward. "Master Jarreth, this is extraordinary work. The village thanks you." "The village inspired me," Jonathan replied, "and so did she." He looked at Elara, who was standing in the crowd, crying openly, and the applause grew louder. They were married on a bright winter morning in the village square. The traveling priest who served Millbrook's small chapel performed the ceremony, with the entire village as witness. Elara wore a dress of deep blue wool, simple and elegant, made by the village women. Jonathan wore his best clothes, newly brushed and mended by the innkeeper's wife. They spoke their vows in clear voices, promising love and loyalty, partnership and truth. When the priest pronounced them married, Jonathan kissed Elara while the crowd cheered. The feast that followed was generous and joyful. Long tables had been set up in the grange, beneath the mural of the chief maiden. Someone had draped the whitewashed section with ribbon and flowers, turning the symbol of erasure into decoration. Baker Simmons had outdone himself with bread and cakes. The village brewers donated ale. Families brought dishes from their own stores, until the tables groaned with food. Jonathan and Elara sat at the head table, holding hands, watching the village celebrate around them. "Are you happy?" Jonathan asked. "I did not know I could be this happy," Elara replied. "I thought happiness was something that happened to other people. People who were not orcs, not different, not alone. You are not alone anymore. Neither are you." They danced, or tried to. Neither of them was particularly skilled, but the crowd did not care. They stumbled through a country dance, laughing, while the musicians played and the village clapped. Later, as the celebration continued, Beth pulled Elara aside. "We wanted to give you something," she said. She held out a small wrapped package. Inside was a book. A journal, actually, bound in leather with blank pages. "For recording your travels," Beth explained. "So you will remember us, and so someday you can tell your children where you came from." Elara hugged her, wordless with emotion. Thomas approached Jonathan with a similar gift, a wooden box containing pigments and brushes, all carefully wrapped. "So you do not run out," Thomas said gruffly. "And so you remember which village gave you your wife." Jonathan thanked him, voice rough, and Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. The celebration lasted into the evening. When the stars came out, Jonathan and Elara slipped away, walking through the quiet village to Elara's cottage. "It will be strange to leave," Elara said, looking at the small building that had been her home for 6 years. "We can stay if you want. I can take commissions nearby." "No, I want to travel with you. I want to see the world you see, paint beside you, build a life that is ours rather than just mine or just yours. Then we will leave in the spring, after the roads clear. Where will we go first?" "Wherever needs a limner and a harvest worker," she smiled. "That is everywhere. Then we have many choices." They spent the winter in Millbrook, living in Elara's cottage, working on small projects. Jonathan painted several family portraits for village members who had never thought to commission art before. Elara repaired tools and taught binding techniques to younger workers who wanted to learn, and every evening they sat together by the fire, planning their future. "I want children," Elara said one night. "Someday. Not now, but someday." "So do I," Jonathan replied. "I want to teach them to see the world truly, the way my mother taught me. And I will teach them to work, to use their hands, to take pride in skill. They will be extraordinary. They will be ours." Spring came gradually, melting the snow and opening the roads. Jonathan and Elara packed carefully, taking only what could be carried. Elara's books, Jonathan's paints, clothing, tools, a few precious items. The village came to see them off. The reeve presented them with a letter of introduction, vouching for Jonathan's skill and Elara's work ethic. "You are always welcome back," the reeve said. "Millbrook is your home if you want it." "Thank you," Elara said, "but I think home is wherever we go together now." They left on a morning of birdsong and new leaves, walked the road south toward villages and towns and the wider world. Behind them, the mural of the chief maiden watched over the grange, and the granary doors stood ready for the next harvest. Ahead of them, The road stretched endless and full of possibility. They traveled for 3 years, working their way through the southern provinces. Jonathan painted signs and portraits, murals and devotional panels. Elara worked harvests, taught binding, and occasionally modeled when Jonathan needed a figure for a commissioned work. People remarked on them, of course. A human man and an orc woman traveling together, clearly in love. Some places welcomed them. Some places did not. They learned to read villages quickly, to know where they would be safe and where they should move on. In a riverside town called Ashford, Jonathan was commissioned to paint the chapel ceiling. The work took 4 months, and during that time Elara realized she was pregnant. She told him one evening as he was washing paint from his hands. "I am carrying a child." He went still, then turned to her slowly. "Truly, truly." He whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her carefully. "A child, our child. Your child will be half orc," Elara said seriously. "The world will not always be kind. Then we will teach our child to see truth and work hard and love fiercely, and the world will have to adjust." Their daughter was born in spring in a midwife's house in Ashford. She was small, perfect, with green-tinted skin lighter than Elara's and her father's brown eyes. They named her Gemma. Jonathan painted her constantly, sleeping, waking, learning to crawl. His sketchbooks filled with studies of her face, her hands, her expressions. Elara taught her to see plants and seasons, to understand the world of growing things. When Gemma was 2, they returned to Millbrook for the first time since they had left. The village welcomed them with celebration. The mural and the granary doors were still pristine, well maintained. A new generation of children had grown up seeing the sheaf maiden every day, understanding that beauty came in many forms. The reeve, older now but still in office, greeted them warmly. "Welcome home, even if just for a visit." "We wanted Gemma to see where her mother became visible," Jonathan said. They stayed a month, and during that time Jonathan painted a 3rd mural, this one in the village school. It showed children of all kinds, human and orc and half-blooded, learning together. When they left again, they carried letters from the village workers to their counterparts in other towns, spreading word of skilled harvest workers and skilled painters who could be trusted. 2 years later, their 2nd daughter was born in a mountain village. They named her Freya, and she had her mother's amber eyes and her father's smile. The family traveled in a wagon now, fitted with storage for paints and tools and the growing collection of children's things. Jonathan painted, Elara worked harvests, and both girls learned to see the world as a place of truth and beauty. In a border town called Millstone, when Gemma was 7 and Freya was 5, Jonathan was offered a permanent position as the town's master painter. "We could stay," he told Elara. "Have a home, give the girls stability," Elara considered. "Do you want to stay?" "I want whatever makes you happy." "That is not an answer," Jonathan smiled. "I love traveling. I love seeing new places, new faces, but I also love the idea of somewhere permanent. Somewhere the girls can have friends and schooling." "Then we stay," Elara decided. "For a while, at least. We can always travel again when they are grown." They bought a house in Millstone, a sturdy building with a studio for Jonathan and a garden for Elara. Jonathan became the town painter, creating murals and portraits and signs. Elara worked the local harvests and started teaching binding classes to anyone who wanted to learn. Gemma and Freya grew up in Millstone, surrounded by their parents' love and the town's gradual acceptance. They were unusual, being half-orc, but their father's reputation and their mother's skill earned them respect. Jonathan continued to paint truth. Every commission, every wall, every board received his full attention and honesty. And in every work, somewhere, he included Elara. Sometimes obviously, sometimes hidden in a background figure, but always there. "Why do you still paint me?" she asked one evening, watching him work on a tavern sign that featured a background figure who was clearly her. "Because you are my truth," he said simply. "Because the first time I saw you, I saw beauty the world had ignored, and I never want to forget that moment or that truth or you." She went red, even after all these years. "You are still ridiculous, and you are still beautiful." Their son was born when Gemma was 12. They named him Pen, and he had his mother's strength and his father's eye for detail. The family continued to grow, to work, to love. Jonathan painted Millstone into a place known for its art. Elara taught a generation of workers to bind sheaves with skill and pride. And every year on their wedding anniversary, they returned to Millbrook to visit the mural and the granary doors, to show their children where the story began. On their 20th anniversary, standing in the Millbrook Grange with their 3 children, Jonathan looked at the sheaf maiden on the wall and then at Elara beside him. "Still beautiful," he said. "Still ridiculous," she replied. Gemma, who was 19 now and training to be a painter herself, said, "You two are impossible." "Impossibly in love," Jonathan agreed. Freya rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Pen, who was 8, just looked confused. They stood together beneath the mural, a family built on truth and love, on seeing and being seen. The village of Millbrook continued its work around them, the harvest never ending, the cycle always turning. And on the wall, painted in pigments that had lasted 2 decades and would last many more, the sheaf maiden bound her wheat in eternal harvest, beautiful and true, exactly as she had always been. Later, when the children were exploring the village, Elara and Jonathan walked to the granary. The doors still stood, weathered but intact, showing the agricultural year in careful detail. "You regret any of it?" Elara asked. "The fight with the council, the traveling, the struggle to make people see," Jonathan considered. "No, the struggle gave us our life. And our life gave us everything that matters. The children, the work, the love, all of it, everything." He took her hand. "You are the best thing I ever painted and the best thing I ever found. I am not a thing to be found. True, you are a person who chose to be seen. And I am grateful every day that you chose to be seen by me." She leaned against him, and they stood in the quiet afternoon, watching their children play in the village that had tried to erase her and had instead learned to see. Years later, when Jonathan was old and his hands were not as steady as they once had been, he painted one final mural. It was in Millstone on the side of the town hall, and it showed the full span of his life. A young man learning to see for his blind mother. A limner painting a harvest mural. An orc woman binding sheaves. A wedding in a village square. Children growing. A family traveling. A home being built, and through every scene the same figure appeared, Elara. Young and old, working and resting, laughing and serious, always present, always true, always beautiful. When it was finished, the whole town came to see. His children came, now adults with children of their own. Gemma had become a master painter in her own right. Freya managed a large farming cooperative. Pen was a teacher. They stood together, 3 generations, looking at the wall. "That is your story," Gemma said to her parents. "No," Jonathan replied. "That is our truth." Elara, whose hair was gray now and whose hands bore the marks of decades of work, smiled. "It is a good truth. The best." They walked home through Millstone streets, hand in hand as they had been for 45 years. The town knew them, loved them, saw them. Jonathan still painted when his hands allowed. Elara still worked when the harvests came. But mostly they sat in their garden, surrounded by children and grandchildren, telling stories of murals and whitewash, scaffolds and sheaves. The day a man told an orc woman she was beautiful and everything changed. "Tell us about the door frame," their youngest granddaughter begged. She had heard the story 100 times but never tired of it. "Your grandmother walked right into it," Jonathan said, grinning. "Because no one had ever called me beautiful before," Elara added, "and I did not know what to do with the words. And then I learned," Elara said. "I learned that being seen truly is a gift, that love is built on truth, that beauty is not what the world says it is, but what we choose to see in each other. And that painters are ridiculous," Gemma added. "Impossibly ridiculous," Freya agreed. "But loved anyway," Pen finished. Jonathan and Elara looked at each other and smiled, and in that smile was everything they had built together. A life of truth and work and love. A family that saw each other clearly. A legacy of paintings that would outlast them both. And somewhere in Millbrook, the sheaf maiden still bound her wheat on the grange wall, beautiful and true, a testament to the day one man looked past what the world saw and painted what was really there. The day nobody had ever called her beautiful, until the man finally did, and everything changed.